Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Daniel Kilov, as you now all know, and I'm a memory athlete. I'm a 3-time silver medalist at the Australian Memory Championships, and I hold a national record for the memorization of abstract images. Now, before I get into things, by a show of hands, who among you, if any of you at all, is already familiar with the somewhat bizarre world of competitive memorizing? Okay, so very few of you. and that makes sense because the World Memory Championships is probably the worst spectator sport of all time. So if you want to have an idea of what it's like to be at one of these competitions, just picture a very large examination hall, dead silence, filled with furrowed brows, and over about 3 days and 10 different disciplines, memory athletes come from all over the world and basically spend this time in deep concentration, internalizing as much completely useless information as they can. So this is like binary digits, names and faces, fictional historic dates, that sort of thing. But while they aren't much to watch, the athletes that compete in these competitions are capable of some really extraordinary things. The memory athlete Katie Commode, for example, can memorize 97 names and faces in just 5 minutes. To give that a little bit of context, this means that she could probably memorize all 29 Australian Prime Ministers in the order in which they were elected in less than 100 seconds. By comparison, as the British mnemonist Ed Cook points out in his book Remember, Remember, Oxford history undergraduates can freely name, on average, only 9 of the 52 British Prime Ministers. They haven't even heard of more than half of them, and their professors are not much better. Another memory athlete, a guy named Johannes Marlow, can memorize over 1,000 random digits in as little as 15 minutes. And in 2010, my own coach, the 4 times Australian memory champion Tansel Ali, memorized the entire Sydney Yellow Pages, both volumes, and he did this in less than 3 weeks. Yeah. So I can tell from your reactions that you probably all agree with me that these are some impressive feats of mental gymnastics. And I hope as well that some of the giggling suggests that most of you will also agree with me when I say that these are completely useless and kind of absurd feats. But what I'm going to suggest today is that while memory sports are a modern invention, the first World Memory Championships was I think in 1991, I'll be really embarrassed if I've misremembered that. The techniques used by memory athletes are not new. And when we look at the history of mnemonic techniques, we discover that they are an almost universal aspect of human experience. And that as a rule, throughout history, they have also been deeply practical. In 1602, shortly after his imprisonment for heresy and sedition, the Italian theologian Tommaso Campanella wrote a book called The City of the Sun. Now, this was an important work, early work of utopian fiction, and the titular city was full of ingenious inventions and discoveries. In my opinion, the most fantastic of these were the painted walls of the city itself. In addition to providing protection, the walls acted as pages of an enormous visual encyclopedia. Constructed in 7 concentric rings, the walls were illustrated with images of stars and planets, mathematical figures and formulae, the countries, cultures, and languages of mankind, and then minerals, plants, and animals. And the innermost ring was dedicated to humankind and basically represented various arts and their inventors. In Campanella's utopian vision, the children of the City of the Sun would run around these walls, guided by instructors, and they would learn effortlessly, really in the manner of learning a game. And in the story, according to Campanella, these children would learn in just 1 year what would take 15 years to learn by conventional methods. Furnished with this knowledge, the citizenry of the City of the Sun would then go on to lead lives filled with wisdom and creativity and all the other things that you'd expect to find in a work of utopian fiction. Now, the City of the Sun is, of course, a work of fiction, but is it fantasy? Now, as it turns out, the educational methods portrayed by Campanella have actually been used for thousands of years. So in Campanella's day, in Europe at least, these techniques were known as the art of memory. Originating in ancient Greece, the art of memory with which Campanella would have been familiar was a cornerstone of Western education right up until about the 16th century. But indigenous cultures across the globe have also employed techniques very much like the ones used or described in Campanella's utopian fiction. In one study from several decades ago, for instance, elders of the North American Navajo were able to classify 700 distinct species of insect by memory alone, recording names, sounds, behaviors, and habitats. Now, I very much doubt that there are any bug experts alive outside of these indigenous communities who could perform a feat like that. The Matsis people of Brazil and Peru have also recently documented their traditional medicine in a 500-page encyclopedia that was previously stored entirely in memory. And as the archaeologist Lynn Kelly notes, Indigenous Australians have long used songlines to cultivate encyclopedic memories for both the country and the plants and animals that inhabit it. The Australian landscape acts in these cultures just like the walls of the City of the Sun, as a canvas on which to display mnemonic imagery encoded through art, song, and other rituals. Furthermore, and this is a claim I'll be defending in depth in my workshop for those of you who might decide to come along, research on world-class performers suggests that what mediates genius... I've forgotten my place. I'm just joking. What mediates genius in fields as diverse as dance, music, chess, and science are learned mental representations encoded in memory rather than any idea of kind of innate talent. Now, these two sources of insight, anthropology on the one hand and cognitive psychology on the other, suggest a vision very much like Campanella's, of an education system which, through creative play, cultivates our capacity for genius. Now, science fiction has long had a history of predicting and inspiring new technologies. My suggestion then is that the City of the Sun should not be read only as science fiction, but as a roadmap to a better, more effective way to learn. Now, of course, the best way to convince you of the efficacy of these techniques is to have you experience them for yourselves. And since this is a medical conference, I must admit I don't know anything about medicine, but I did want to try and teach you something that I thought might be vaguely useful to you. And so what we'll be doing is generating some weird and wonderful mnemonic images to help us remember a little bit about the structure and function of the brain. So I'm going to see if this... There you go. Oh, I love it when technology does what it's supposed to. Now, so I'm going to be doing most of the heavy lifting here. So I'm going to be generating kind of weird and wonderful mnemonic images. And what I want you to do is to visualize these images on the page as I describe them, and really bring all of your focus and creative energy to bear here. To quote the writer and lexicographer, the author of one of the first really important dictionaries, Samuel Johnson, the true art of memory is the art of attention. Okay, so we're going to start with the frontal lobe. And as you can see here, the frontal lobe plays an important role in generating abstract thought. And so to help us remember both what this is called, both that it's called the frontal lobe and what its role is, I want you to imagine your front door just opening up here at the front of your brain, and standing just behind the door, engaging in some very high-level complex thought, is Albert Einstein. Next, moving on to the temporal lobe here. So to help us remember that the temporal lobe is involved in processing sound, what I'd like you to do is imagine a metronome sticking out above the brain here, somewhere above your ear, keeping tempo. Tempo sounds like temporal, And so this is going to be our mnemonic here. Moving on to the parietal lobe. I'd like you here to imagine a piranha chomping down on top of your head. And naturally, this is going to cause you pain. And that's how we're going to remember that the parietal lobe plays an important role in touch and pain. And to finish off the cerebral cortex, we have the occipital lobe. So I don't need to point to these yet, but you get the idea. So here what I'd like you to do is imagine an octopus latched onto the back of your head. But to remember that this is the occipital octopus, all along its tentacles, I want you to imagine that they are covered in eyeballs. Great. So as a general rule, things that are disgusting, things that are funny, things that are sexy even, are really memorable. In fact, the philosopher and theologian Thomas Aquinas wrote in the Summa Theologica that creating memory images full of naked women engaged in all kinds of interesting acts was absolutely fine, according to Catholicism, as long as it was done in the service of memorizing the faith. That's true, and seems like a great loophole to me. So, okay, so we're not going to notice here that we're not going to engage in any kind of revision or repetition. We're just going to move straight on now to the kind of so-called reptilian brain. So the cerebellum plays an important role in balance. And so to remember this, I'd like you to imagine a tightrope walker sort of stepping gingerly across the surface of the cerebellum. And to help them balance, you're going to imagine that they have bells. That's how we're going to remember cerebellum, the bell, attached to their balancing stick. I don't know what you call that. The medulla oblongata is responsible for autonomic functions such as breathing and also heartbeat. And so to remember this, I'd like you to visualize on this diagram here, or maybe even imagine visualizing this attached to your own brain, sticking with metals, using metals to pin lungs and hearts, tiny lungs and hearts, to the medulla oblongata. And finally, to remember that the pons helps regulate sleep and dreaming, I want you to imagine that it's covered by a peaceful and dreamy pond. Okay. Now, I know that was a lot of information, but now I want to test you and see how much of this you remember. Now, don't worry if you don't remember everything, right? We went through this information very, very quickly. We went through it only once, and certainly much faster than you might normally cover this kind of information if you were learning it from a textbook or whatever. But let's see how we go. So to start off with, what is this area of the brain called? And what does it do? Yeah, very good. Clever audience. All right. And this lobe? Sorry? Occipital. And what's it do? And here? Yeah. And what's it do? Very good. And over here? Yeah, this is obviously, you guys are obviously working the hardest right now. All right, and over here? Yeah. And here? Yeah, and here? Beautiful. And notice as well that you can access this information in all kinds of different ways. So if I ask you, which part of the brain is responsible for processing sight? You can answer, yeah. And this is important because a lot of the time the way we learn is fairly inflexible, that we learn things in particular contexts that allow us only to recall them in those same contexts. But the techniques of the art of memory allow for a very kind of flexible and robust recall. Now, of course, if you can learn 7 pieces of information at the kind of, or we guess we learned more than that, because we learned both the names and the function, then there's nothing at all preventing you from simply adding more stories and learning another 14 pieces of information, or 140, or 1,400. Now, I can only give you a taste of the techniques of the art of memory in a 20-minute talk. But as you can see, the techniques used by memory athletes are, at their core, about approaching our learning with a sense of playfulness and a sense of mindfulness, a sense of attentiveness. Now, it turns out that we're all memory athletes. In a competitive world, we all need to be able to remember more, to be more creative, more innovative, and focused. And in this sense, the techniques used by memory athletes really don't belong in memory competitions, but should actually be deeply embedded in all of our practical learning. And as a matter of fact, for most of human history, that's exactly how it's been. Thank you.
I think there's one just up there, Hannah. Let's look at that one.
Why do you need notes when you speak?
There's always one person who asks this question. And really, I have to say that one of the reasons I still speak with notes is because I really love this question. So a lot of people think that, because I really like memory and stuff, that I must really be down on technology, that I must resent smartphones for taking over at doing things like memorizing shopping lists or whatever. But in fact, I really love technology. And I think that, and I'm really, really glad that technology can be used to do those sorts of things. So for things that technology does really well, like remembering dates and appointments and reminding me of them, remembering shopping lists and stuff like that, I really love using technology to do it. But there are certain other kinds of things that technology just can't do, at least not yet. So right now, in order to be able to synthesize information, to spot connections between pieces of information, to be creative with information, that requires having it in your head. If you wanted to learn to speak another language, it doesn't matter. You can have the best dictionaries in the world. They're not going to allow you to have a conversation with someone in a different tongue. So in terms of remembering speeches, I think that notes can be really, really great for that. I think the reason that we should improve our memories is for the kinds of things that technology just doesn't do yet. It's about being able to be more creative, to, as I say, synthesize information, think critically about things, and cultivate those kind of higher order and most human mental capacities. But for other things, trivial stuff, I'm happy to delegate that to my phone.
Good answer. Down the front.
Hi. I can't remember if you did mention this, but how did you get into memory, I would say sporting, and how often do you train?
Yeah, good questions. Okay, so I really stumbled into this stuff more or less by accident. I actually had a really terrible memory growing up. And this is actually true, I think, of most memory athletes. Most of the time, what attracts us to the sport is precisely the fact that we struggled with memory in one way or another. So certainly, I think learning difficulties and learning disabilities of all kinds are significantly overrepresented among memory athletes. But I happened to be doing some casual work for a library, and I was helping them transfer their collection from one building to another. And so a whole lot of books would pass through my fingers, and if I found one that was really interesting, I would flip through it. One of these books happened to be about memory. Ironically, I don't remember what the book was called or who it was by, but there was a very simple exercise in there, and I tried it, and I was blown away by how effective it was. That led me to do a little bit of Googling. I found out about the Australian memory champion, Tanzil Ali, and I emailed him with two questions. The first was, is it true that anyone can learn to do this? And the second was, and if it is, can you teach me? And the answer to both questions was yes. As for how often I train, these days I don't really. It was maybe 6 weeks of training 3 hours a day before I first entered the Australian Memory Championships. One of the cool things about these techniques is that there's a really quick return on investment. So unlike, say, learning to speak another language where it can be months, maybe years before you can string a sentence together, really you can start playing around with memory techniques after just an hour or two. But I use these techniques in my practical life as a PhD student. I use them every single day.
Jennifer?
Okay. Yep, so you said one of the techniques with the memory thing is making up a story to remember. So how do you think of a story quickly on the spot?
Yeah, so this is where a lot of the, I guess, skill of memory sports comes into it. You can imagine for world champions that are doing things like memorizing a shuffle deck of cards in 13 seconds, like they're coming up with stories really, really quickly. And really, so Dominic O'Brien, who was the inaugural and subsequent 8 times world memory champion, he says that the memory championships are as much a competition of creativity as they are of memory. But that's something, firstly, that comes through practice, and also that comes through building certain mnemonic systems. So there are certain systems that will generate stories for you, where you might have, let's say for cards, you might have for each card assigned a person, an action, an object. And then the first card that comes up tells you what the character is, the second card tells you what they're doing, and the third card tells you what they're doing it to. And often, because of the way these systems are designed, these images will be really out there and very memorable. So it's a combination both of technique and practice.
So I've had a question via the app. What's the most interesting thing you've done with your unique ability? Have you ever sat the LSATs for someone? Are you secretly a lawyer at Spectre Pearson in New York City?
So I won't answer this question in too much detail. I will say that I am on watch lists at certain casinos. The other thing worth noting, just in relation to this question, which I imagine is a reference to the TV show Suits, right?
Yes.
So I don't like this show, and I don't like it, I think, for the same reason that a lot of doctors don't like medical TV shows, which is that there's no such, just the inaccuracies. So there's no such thing as a photographic or eidetic memory, save for a handful of cases of savant syndrome that are always accompanied by sort of really crippling intellectual disability in other areas. There have been no recorded cases of photographic memory, really. So this is the kind of thing that memory athletes have nightmares. They kind of wake up in cold sweats that someone's just going to come to the competition with some insane natural ability and just blow everyone away. But it's never happened. It's never ever happened.
So that question also asked, what's the most interesting thing you've done with your unique ability?
As I say, I use these techniques all the time in my own research, and I find that really interesting. But certainly also being a speaker about memory has given me lots of great opportunities to travel around the world, come to exciting events like this one. But I think that the most interesting thing, or one of the most interesting things about this journey, which is not going to be interesting to any of you guys, I apologize, is going to be learning the systems that I use to memorize numbers. So I have an internal mnemonic library of 1,000 images, one image for every combination of digits from 000 to 999. This is how I do things like memorize 100 digits in less than 60 seconds or whatever, because these digits basically become images and then they get strung together. And what happens is you end up with a kind of learned synesthesia. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with synesthesia, but it's a neurological condition where the senses get wired up differently. So people will see sounds or taste sounds, or they'll experience numbers as having a kind of three-dimensional shape. And although this is just something that people are kind of born with, I think that the kind of phenomenology of memory techniques is very, very similar to the phenomenology of memory techniques.
I've got another question via the app. So there's a mnemonic for cranial nerves, which I probably shouldn't say aloud. It does reference several offensive and sexually related things. Why is it that we remember things better when they are offensive and related to sex in some way?
Yeah, so I think it's easy to see why from an evolutionary perspective, right? In the sense that you only get really one chance to remember that that's the cave with the scary lions in it. And similarly, it's very evolutionary advantageous to remember that that's the place you go if you want to get laid and pass on your genes. From a neurological perspective, it's because these things release adrenaline and dopamine, which neurotransmitters that play an important role in the activation of the hippocampus, which is important for the encoding of long-term memories. The only thing you have to care about as a memory athlete is whether or not it works.
We've got time for one final question from the floor. Anyone? Someone's very, very keen to ask a question.
Is this on? Okay.
Yes.
I guess I have 2 points. I think, so I'm really sick. So I just guess my first point is that, as medical students, as future doctors, we're really blessed in the sense that, we don't have to remember, like a random image or facts. A lot of our experiences in hospital or with patients are sort of ingrained and linked with us forever. And I was wondering, what sort of tools we could implement in your sport to help us learn things lifelong, because there's endless knowledge that we need to know. And then the second point is a lot of students and doctors, they do get burnout, and we're always told to, exercise or do sort of stress relief activities to really recharge us. I was wondering what sort of things you do to help accentuate and strengthen your ability to learn things. Because you mentioned you train for, say, 3 hours a day. Some of us, for exams, we might be studying for 10 hours straight, and what can we do to make sure our memory is razor sharp?
Yeah, so I'll answer the second question first, because I'm not sure I actually heard the first one, but we'll see how it goes. So the answer to the second one's really simple. It's also really not very sexy. But there are also things you already know, like eat right, get enough sleep, and engage in regular cardiovascular exercise. I mean, that's the best thing you can do for cognitive performance overall. It's the best thing you can do for mood and all of those things. As for the first question, which I think was, you asked how to remember things lifelong. Was that the...
Yeah, because I feel like once we see a patient, it's it actually happened, and we need to, Sorry.
I think how to paraphrase, how do we learn facts and then keep them lifelong?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. That's correct.
Thanks.
Cool. So certainly doing the kinds of things that I've been talking about here are very, very useful. So let me give a really simple example. Everyone here, no doubt, can close your eyes now and mentally navigate your own homes. And chances are you can also all mentally navigate maybe homes that you grew up in but haven't been back to for 10 years. And you can probably also mentally navigate this space even if you've only been here, once or twice. I don't know how long this event's been going on for, but there are really two things that are amazing about this. The first is the volume and detail of this information, right? So you can not just navigate your own home or not just walk into a room, but you know where a kind of lamp is, or what knickknacks might be on your bookshelf or whatever. So that's the first thing that's amazing. The second thing that's amazing is that none of us make any deliberate effort to learn that kind of information. Right? Our brains are just primed. They're really good at remembering that kind of spatial and visual information. And so the sort of secret sauce of the art of memory, of these mnemonic techniques, is to transform the kind of information with which we normally struggle into the kind of thing that we remember effortlessly and for a really, really long time. Now, beyond that, revisiting and revising information is useful. But crucially, it has to be revisiting and revising it in your mind. Engaging in rote repetition, in rote learning and repetition, just reading and rereading, or using flashcards again and again, is nowhere near as effective. In fact, it's basically useless for encoding memories long term. Much, much better is engaging in practicing free recall.
Thank you.
So that's it for this session. Please join me in thanking Daniel Kilov.
Oh, thank you very much.